Hello and a warm welcome to this ICAS On Demand webinar. I'm Justine Ricomany and I head up the Employment and then Devolved Taxes Policy area at ICAS, and I'm pleased to be hosting this webinar today. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Pike Bambridge, the CEO of Pike and Bambridge. Piers is going to talk us through electric vehicles and how they can be provided as company cars using a salary sacrifice arrangement. This is an area of high interest for ICAS members, as I'm sure you're all receiving a lot of queries on it from clients as we move towards 2030, when no new cars with combustion engines will be manufactured and sold in the UK. This presentation should help you to assist your clients and enable you to pass on to them a comprehensive understanding of where to get started on the road to EV. Pike and Bambridge is an ICAS partner, so if you have any questions once you've visited this on-demand webinar, Piers and his team will be able to help you if you contact them directly. So without further ado, it's over to you, Piers.
Thank you very much, Justine. Delighted to join you all here today. And we're going to talk a little bit about electric vehicle salary sacrifice. We've been a partner with ICAS now for a number of years, but it is something certain that's grown a lot of traction in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, with electric vehicles being now a big part of what we do as a whole and a growing part of what we do as a whole. So I'm going to suggest I'm only going to give an introduction to this today. There are, of course, lots of different issues contained within the subject of electric vehicles. Anyone who reads the media at the moment will tell you that. But I'm just going to give you a flavour of it, and we're going to perhaps address some of the typical questions that we encounter as we're talking about salary sacrifice. So moving on, we have now, I think, without doubt, moved into a world of electric mobility. This much is pretty much without contention in terms of some form of electric mobility is coming for most of us over the next 5 to 10 years. And certainly there's the government element of that. There's a societal element of that as well. And actually there's to some degree a sort of trend and fashion element of that coming down the road, if you'll excuse the pun. And there's no doubt about it that that's coinciding with a real seismic shift going on within the industry as a whole. Clearly, the dealership model has been somewhat challenged in recent times, and there's a lot of discussion as to how we move past the dealership model in a world of online and omni-channel service. There's also a move towards electric that the big manufacturers are now 100% behind, well, most of them at least. So certainly Volvo, the likes of VW Group, and Audi, for example, have said they'll recently go to full electric later this decade. And even last week we had Jaguar Land Rover, or JLR as they've rebranded, announcing that Jaguar will be fully electric and that their future is also electric. So even some of the manufacturers who've been more hesitant to commit to the electric future are now very much a part of this. And as well as that, we've also got autonomous and subscription model coming down the road in some form or another, whether it be the fully autonomous vision that maybe Elon Musk has is perhaps up for debate, but certainly some form of autonomous vehicles, freight vehicles, and indeed individual consumer vehicles is going to happen over the next decade. So it's a huge amount of change going on for us all. And then you add the tax element to this as well, and there's another layer of complexity. So hopefully we can help guide ICAS members through some thoughts on that today. Where are we at just now? Well, the market as it stands right now, there's about 32.7 million cars in the UK. And as the latest stats suggest, there's around about 683,000 of those are actually full EVs. The next slide, Justine alluded to earlier, EV sales after 2030 is how it's termed. There will, of course, still be some hybrid vehicles at this point, but we are starting to see more and more manufacturers themselves driving this change where they plan to not really offer any combustion vehicles after 2030. So in terms of new vehicles, it'll be 100% of the market will be electric vehicles after 2030. And I think that's probably a realistic point from a manufacturer point of view. Whether it is from an infrastructure point of view is another question, and perhaps for later. But certainly this is again a massive change coming over this decade. If you think we've been used to the current combustion engine vehicle for 70 or 80 years now, and then within a decade that's all going to be wiped out, whether that be manufacturing, whether that be petrol stations, whether that be whatever else it might be. There's a huge change in a very short space of time. So certainly some interesting impact we'll see from that. When it comes to salary sacrifice, this is something that PwC put out. I think the crossover with societal changes, manufacturing changes around cars, and that crossing over with some of the imperatives that we're seeing from employers around their employee needs. This is just one survey that suggested that 75% of employees said they wanted to work for an organization that makes a positive contribution to society. And of course, that's a broader ESG conversation. But certainly, as we're speaking to employers and indeed employees, we're hearing a lot more around electric vehicles. Of course, cost of living comes into this too, but how the electric vehicle conversation can be considered a positive contribution to the overall societal kind of contribution. So something that's certainly becoming much more relevant for employers, and certainly something that ICA's members and their clients and others need to consider to be really competitive in what is obviously still a very challenging labour market in 2023. And when you look at that in terms of what employers are looking for, we hear three things that continually come up. And it sounds obvious to say this, but the idea of recruiting great people who stay is a really simple way of summarizing all of our challenges when it comes to running businesses. Certainly, I certainly empathize with those business leaders who that's their motivation number one with their people parts of their business, and how do we do that better without just simply looking at financials. Also, employers are very clear at the moment when we're speaking to them that ESG improvements are crucial to their business. We've got things like potentially carbon tax coming down the line, and we've got all sorts of other elements to ESG. Of course, that's more than just electric cars. I'm not suggesting it's only that, but certainly when we're speaking to employers, it's been a challenging few years for many businesses. It perhaps will continue to be in the coming years, or at least the coming year or two. And given that, we need to make sure the ESG improvements are feasible within a cost framework that works for people. So ESG improvements that don't cost the earth is a big priority for a lot of the organisation we speak to. And then perhaps from a benefits point of view, we do speak obviously to a lot of HR teams, but also business leaders, that when they're looking to look at their benefits mix, they often find that it's a very complicated environment at times with benefits. It can be hugely wide-ranging and uptake is very low, or it can be very insurance heavy, which potentially for the younger generational employees, that's such a challenging labour market to attract, perhaps don't ring as clearly for those possible employees. So simple enhanced benefits without a huge amount of extra hassle that has to come with administering those benefits and managing those benefits. So those are three kind of themes we find that are constantly coming up with employers. And then when it comes to the employees and people in general, I suppose we all have this sense, I think, of climate change. Certainly, it's going to be a divisive subject, but there is something happening potentially. Let's keep it as high level as that from a climate change point of view. And most people are looking for areas they can contribute to tackling climate change, not necessarily to solve climate change, but at least to contribute to doing something to tackle it. Of course, there's a challenge at the moment with the cost of living crisis and the inflationary pressures that the UK in particular, but globally, we're all under. And saving money during that process or during that period is something that we're not finding is happening in most parts of life, but is something that most people are looking to do and give themselves more net pay is obviously a part of that. And then from a people point of view, again, coming back to that point about interesting benefits, a lot of the times when we're doing engagement surveys with our clients, we're hearing that the benefits that matter, benefits that are interesting, benefits that stand out, that it's really important as part of the benefits mix, not just insurances or salary sacrifice pension schemes, but actually benefits that can help them in their day-to-day lives. It seems to be a big sort of theme that's running through people teams and HR teams that we speak to. So really a very congruent message with what employers are looking for and also what employees, I suppose, are looking for. So that's all well and good. I suppose then how does it work for a salary sacrifice? And conscious, as always, when I speak to finance professionals, as mostly I suspect we will be doing today, I don't want to verge too far into Justine's area of expertise, or indeed all of your area of expertise, but how does it actually show up on a pay slip? As it's just one example here. And in contrast to a typical finance or lease vehicle, it is quite a bit different. So there's a lot of misunderstanding potentially about salary sacrifice costs. So this is something just to give you a sense of how it breaks down. So in contrast, you will always have with salary sacrifice, or almost always, a full insurance cover for both the main employee and the partner, typically spouse or partner as well. Accident management and servicing will also always be included in any lease that you secure through a salary sacrifice agreement, and that includes things like maintenance and tires and roadside assistance and everything else. Typically, most salary sacrifices are actually only 3-year agreements, or limited to 3-year agreements, which means you never have to do an MOT on these vehicles, and they're fully covered by things like manufacturer warranties for the term of the agreement. So unless you're doing a very high mileage, that pretty much is covered. And from a tax point of view, obviously, simplistically, and I'm conscious this is simplistically, the payments that are taken out of your salary, and salary exchange perhaps more accurately, are actually taking out pre your income and national insurance contributions, income tax and national insurance contributions, meaning that although there is a benefit in kind, generally speaking, all of those things, the insurance, the car, the maintenance, the servicing, the tires and everything else, come out pre-tax in a simplistic sense. And that really is the main benefit that comes from salary sacrifice. So that's a huge change for people. There's no deposits, there's no road tax, there's no all of the things we might be used to from a vehicle lease or a vehicle contract. You don't really have a salary sacrifice. This is one sort of a simple payment that covers everything. So and then it gets deducted on part of your payroll, and it's set for 3 years. So instead of something like a salary sacrifice pension, which potentially is a percentage and therefore changes based on your pay, this is just a set 3-year agreement. So not a huge amount of ongoing payroll support required. Once it's set up, it just continues to flow, and for 3 years, and then the car is returned. So that's kind of how the practicals of it work, and it really is pretty simple. However, I'm always conscious that in any kind of presentation we're giving, any discussion I'm having about salary sacrifice, it's important to represent the some negatives as well. So what are the pitfalls of adopting a scheme for employers and to some extent employees? Well, some providers will offer a combination of a kind of hands-off online portal and call centers, and it's interesting to see at the moment the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, is looking at salary sacrifice because it falls into somewhat of a grey area from a regulatory point of view, given the fact it's actually something that's almost a consumer finance agreement, but to some degree is a company car or sold on an unregulated or non-regulated rather finance agreement. And what the challenge with that comes is if some of the providers you might deal with or you might see have an online portal and a call center, potentially that means your HR team is left fielding questions with regards to that. So it's something that can be both time consuming and also to some extent not really the area of expertise, given it's a relatively significant kind of financial commitment for employees. So very important that whichever provider, and there are numerous good ones, we would like to think we're one of the best ones, but there's certainly multiple options out there. But looking at a provider that doesn't just offer an online portal and a call center is a useful thing to bear in mind, certainly. And there are a number, not just ourselves, that do that. One thing to also be aware of if clients are looking at salary sacrifice schemes as an online resource, if you're Googling the best salary sacrifice schemes, there are some providers that will charge a fee to employers. The best ones don't. The leading salary sacrifice scheme providers, none of them charge a fee to the employer to kind of administration fee at this stage. It may be in the future, but unlike perhaps other benefits where there's a charge for administering the scheme, it doesn't typically happen in salary sacrifice schemes. But there are some out there, if you look in the small print, that will charge you something like 1.5% of the list price of a car for any order that you place, which obviously, given that electric vehicles can be on average 50 to 60,000 pounds, that can start to add up quite quickly for the employer as an administration fee. So something to look out for when you're either advising clients or looking at schemes yourselves. And then from a payroll management point of view, it would be unrealistic to say that it doesn't take any additional time. It should be limited how much administration, but it does take additional time. So it has to be factored in that from a payroll point of view. Payroll providers, I think, from our experience, are typically now much more aware of this, and it's not a particularly difficult scheme to administer, I'm assured by the numerous payroll providers that I speak to regularly. But it is something that is an extra administration, and of course, somewhat positively, somewhat negatively, the more work it is, the more uptake there has been, the more impact it has for you as a business or for your clients as a business, but also potentially the more administration you're going to have to administer it. Typically at setup, that's when that mostly is the setup of the scheme and setup of each individual car that's getting delivered. But once done, as it says there, the salary sacrifice pension, as I mentioned before, is less work, I would suggest, than that, and the cost is fixed for 3 years, so it's pretty simple to process. So that's kind of some ideas of the pitfalls and things certainly to consider. There are numerous other questions we typically have, and I believe Justine's going to share some of her questions or some additional questions that we perhaps come across.
Yes, Piers. So my question for you, having listened to that, is what actually happens when an employee leaves during a salary sacrifice arrangement?
So yeah, it's a tricky one to answer in a one-size-fits-all manner, this one. And one thing I think we're very cautious about is making sweeping statements with regards to EVs and financial or environmental impacts or anything else, because there obviously is an element of subjectivity to many things, particularly that environmental question. But one thing all good salary sacrifice schemes provide is termination cover, and what we term full termination cover. And broadly speaking, there are not many differences between termination cover from the different providers, to be totally honest. It should cover termination for employees who leave the organisation at any point. So after 6 months from delivery, there's zero costs for either the employer or the employee if they were to leave that employment. There are a few exclusions, so it's worth kind of considering that. So things like if an employee is let go or sacked from gross misconduct, that might be excluded from any termination cover. So there are elements that would be then fall on the employee, obviously. But generally speaking, all of the different reasons why that might happen, whether it be redundancy or resignation or any other reason why someone might leave employment, termination is after 6 months. There's zero cost at either side. What that typically is covered by, Justine, is actually that the monthly cost of the lease does typically go up, because obviously it's a kind of a cover that allows you to have that risk aversion, if you like, that not having that issue. So typically by about 10%. So if you have a £500 salary sacrifice or £500 agreement, there's all sorts of complexity in the back of this in terms of VAT and the different things that you might be able to get to the end payslip deduction. But what we typically find is that employers will sort of pass back, as you might do with your salary sacrifice pension, they'll pass back the employer national insurance contribution savings to cover off any termination cover. The employer is still typically up on the deal if you look at it in that terms, because whatever the residual NICs, employer NICs left over is then banked. There's very little risk for the employer, because obviously after 6 months there's no cost, and there's no cost to administer the scheme. On the employee side, uptake tends to be a lot better, which is kind of beneficial for everyone, because the employee knows that you've got that kind of that risk kind of covered off. There is other options, or there are, sorry, excuse me, other options with regards to standard termination cover. It's a little bit more limited, and kind of can save the organisation more money by passing all of that national insurance contributions back to the employer, and just charging the employee for that termination cover. And that can be more around, it's a very small organisation with very low staff turnover. That's something to perhaps consider. We typically find about 97%, I think at last count, of our new schemes over the last 12 months have taken full termination cover, because it just gives you that peace of mind that, if someone were to leave the organisation, we obviously, you've seen it with company cars in the past. It can be a real pain to have to administer a fleet. And really the great thing about a salary sacrifice scheme is it's not a company car fleet. We often find that the termination cover is what really separates this out and makes it so much simpler to administer. But worth looking at the small print, as always with these things, and making sure you're provided it does cover that off with you. So. Oh, Justine, you're on mute, I think, at the moment. Sorry, apologies.
Whoops, I'm sorry about that. Yes, it's really interesting that it's not a fleet mechanism. I think that could be a real game changer for anyone that's considering doing this, actually. So another question for you then, Piers, is the charge point infrastructure in place, which you mentioned earlier, to support the growth in EV sales? And I know that that's certainly been a question that I'm having at the moment, actually.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, again, if you watch the media at the moment, the media have, as you probably are aware, or anyone watching this in the UK will be aware, the media have really got after electric vehicles this year, and perhaps not in the most informed fashion. Who would ever imagine that from the media? But it is sometimes a bit of a challenge when we're dealing with customers who perhaps have heard from organisations who, you know, for whatever motives, are potentially being a little bit overly negative around electric vehicles. However, that being said, I think for us, we do a lot of work on pros and cons of electric vehicles. We do an awful lot of fact finds with customers. One of the things we always do with customers, we do a fact find with every employee to kind of check feasibility of changing to electric. And so I think it is really important to not kind of gloss over and say, oh, our infrastructure is fine. I've driven EVs now for 4 or 5 years. There's probably been 3 or 4 times where it's been a pain. So, you know, for whatever reason, I can perhaps cover that. As a starting point, a good question to be asking, I think, all of your employees is what percentage of employees have off-street parking. And I think surprisingly to a lot of people, there's 18 million households in the UK out of 28 million households total that have off-street parking capacity. So that's about 63% in Scotland alone. So it's a large percentage of people that can put a charge point in. And if you have a charge point in, the next question essentially is, do you drive more than 200 miles a day regularly? Because if you do drive more than 200 miles a day, fuel saving is going to be great. So electric would be great for that point of view. But probably the hassle at this stage, I would suggest the infrastructure isn't really there. Bearing in mind 200 miles a day is about 50,000 miles a year. That's a fairly small percentage of the world that drive that kind of level. And if you're driving more than 200 miles a day, it is like charging your phone overnight, really, as long as you can get charge point infrastructure put in place. However, there is still 10 million households who don't have that. 37% of Scotland population, does not have charge points capacity off street. And that's then where I think it does come into kind of really having a proper fact find, if you like, on what the feasibility is. Without off-street parking, you know, I would suggest the 10,000 miles mark per annum is probably quite a good benchmark. If you do more than 10,000 miles per annum and you live in an apartment, or you don't have the capacity to install charge points, then again, it's not necessarily you shouldn't get an electric car, but you should certainly consider what that means, what the charge point infrastructure is locally to you, and what the cost of that charge point infrastructure is. Hugely unregulated charge points at the moment. So you've got council-backed ones, which can be 20p per kilowatt. You've got public motorway service ones, just like with petrol, that can be 79p per kilowatt. Without going into the detail of what the impact of that is, clearly a 4 times differential is a big difference between the cost. However, if you look at the media at the moment, they say, well, public charge points are really expensive. And of course, they're going straight to motorway service stations and drawing that comparison. We're seeing now OVO Energy recently launched their EV-only tariff. Now, there are starting to be energy companies actually wanting new business, and they've launched a 10p per kilowatt charge, which means your pence per mile is somewhere around the 3.5 to 4p per mile. And you're then looking at 15p a mile, probably on a typical combustion engine vehicle at the moment. So hugely cheaper if you can get that kind of home charge point. It's worth bearing in mind that most salary sacrifice providers will include a charge point as part of your salary sacrifice as an option. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a big capital expense, and you can obviously have the tax benefits of putting that through your employment. That all being said, there are around 36,000 public charge points, and this is actually October 2022. So we need to have this updated because they don't get released by any central organization just now. But there's 36,000 charge points, around 6,500 of those are rapid or ultra rapid. And there are only about 8,300 petrol stations. Now, of course, there is an element of petrol stations a lot quicker to fuel, but on the flip side, there are 80 million homes that should be acting as petrol stations over the next 10 years. So if you think about the demand on petrol stations versus charge points, it really shouldn't be anything like the same if the government backs, for example, charge point installations that it has in the past and is continuing to do so. So there is a lot of opportunity, I think, to get around the infrastructure challenges. However, our team normally say with the clients they deal with, you probably just need to bear in mind 2 to 3 trips a year. You'll probably need to plan a bit more. And if that's something that you're just not comfortable doing, then it might not be right for you just now. And I think that's probably the best way I would summarize it too. There's so many different areas to this, but it's certainly a very individual case by case answer there.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating, because I know a lot of people are actually worried about the sort of distance that you can drive an electric vehicle and and where you can actually charge them. So that's actually opened my eyes a little bit there as well, Piers. So come on, here's another question for you then. What about the impact on the road to net zero?
Yeah, the questions get harder, don't they, Justine? Thanks for giving me these tougher and tougher questions. So just as a final point on range, by the way, you mentioned it and I didn't mention it, but a lot of the new models are coming out now talking about 400 plus miles. So the new VW is coming out with 430 miles, just launched last week. There's a new company called Fisker who are launching the Fisker Ocean, which is a sort of £35,000 car, so not as expensive as some of the German brands, and that's going to be around about the 430 mile range. So as you start to get about that 400 mile range as well, you are certainly in a lot of a more comfortable area. Bearing in mind winter driving, how you drive, all those kind of things do factor into that. So we won't go into that any further for today. But yes, a great question about the road to net zero. And I think it's probably one where I would put a bit of a warning, a bit of a stamp of care on this part of the webinar. I'm fortunate enough to deal with electric vehicles on a daily basis. I'm fortunate enough to deal with a lot of stakeholders in their road to net zero on a daily basis. However, everybody's point of view on this does have a large amount of subjectivity globally. I think it's probably fair to say there is overarching an agreement there's a positive impact on the road to net zero. However, how things are calculated, how things in terms of embodied CO2 and CO2 equivalents and greenhouse gases as a whole, there's a huge amount of question marks around how exactly this should be calculated. And that's not just in cars. But simplistically, I think I can give you some statistics from a real organizations, which I think is beneficial to show. As a very simplistic from an organization we deal with, this was a kind of year one and what their projected saving is over a 3-year period, assuming nobody else takes up the scheme. And what we did here was we considered employees, of the organization that were planning to change their car. It was not necessarily I'm making an EV switch to be more environmental, but I am going to change my car anyway. And I will not be able to buy an electric car without the salary sacrifice benefits. This was probably 18 months ago. So with electric vehicles coming down in price, it probably would be easier now. But back then, this organization, the feedback we got was, I'm only changing to electric because of salary sacrifice. So therefore, it was a very easy causal link between, okay, I would have gone into a combustion vehicle. I now will go into an electric vehicle. And we were able to draw comparisons because obviously the nature of the beast, we know how many thousands of miles these people were driving, and we knew what their current vehicle was emitting in terms of emissions. And so year one saving was about 37.2 tons of CO2 equivalent. And then the sort of 3-year projected saving based on no more uptake, which is perhaps a bit unrealistic. We have had more uptake since the statistics, but we were trying to give a kind of, as much as possible, an impact statement that was real and accurate for of course the embodied CO2 in those new cars. There is a question mark about that, but from a simply an emissions point of view, this was pretty much non-negotiable. If you then go on to, are they actually better for the planet? Well, so this is another one, and I'm conscious again that this is highly contentious at the moment, but I think if you actually look at, undoubtedly they are better for the environment. This is the International Energy this month released this data. So there's a fairly large amount of data now that supports this, that if you compare with purchasing a new non-EV there is no doubt that EVs are better for the environment over a passage of time. However, if you compare them with walking, if you compare them with, you know, the sunk CO2 costs with your 10-year-old car that have already been accounted for, if you like, in that vehicle, then just changing to EVs may not be the best solution. And I suppose the downside of that is they're still giving out emissions, you know, all the knock-on effects of low emission zones you might not be able to drive in, and so on and so on. But from a simplistic sense, if you compare combustion with non-EVs, there's sometimes a bit of a mistaken information in the press and the media again, but there's more impact in terms of to build the electric car. And as you can see on these graphs, what this compares, because it's quite small graphics, it compares the impact over a period of time of what the CO2 is, or CO2 equivalent, I should say, is for the different vehicles, and then what the combustion engine vehicles. And the blue line is the manufacturing piece. So it's very, very close, actually, how much difference there is between manufacturing. And obviously, once you then put the car on the road, the renewable energy element of this, of course, is also important. But the tipping point of positive environment impact, as it says, is partly going to be made up by how you then how you then charge your electric vehicle, whether that is with renewable sources. And Norway is a great example where the return point of the extra CO2 in building an EV is returned much quicker in Norway than, for example, as you might imagine, in the United States, where it's much more coal-powered electricity. But in Norway, so much more renewable sources means that it's about 6,000 or 7,000 miles. As soon as you go over that point, the EV is better. And of course, that just compound effect after that point in terms of how much better it is. So yeah, it's a bit of a contentious one. Alongside that, I thought it might be worthwhile bringing up the kind of battery production piece as well, Justine, because that normally comes up with those who are well researched into electric vehicles. And yes, again, as with if I was pitching to you an iPhone in 2005, you know, it's interesting, there wasn't the same amount of examination of whether your iPhone was good for lithium or cobalt mining at that point, and people sort of adopted it as, this is great. But somehow electric vehicles, you can question whether there's a lobbying conversation to be had there. But from a batteries point of view in electric vehicles, yes, they do tend to have large elements of cobalt and lithium. Lithium mining's not great for the environment. There's not much mining that is great for the environment. And it continues to be a major negative. I mean, as it says, they're hard rock mining, I think mostly in Australia. And there's kind of brine technology, which is also quite heavily heavy in its usage of water, and tends to be in quite dry areas, the way that it's done, typically in Chile, actually, interestingly. But they both have a fairly significant environmental impact. On top of that negative environmental impact, when you come to the cobalt element of batteries, you're often looking at cobalt that's brought out from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And obviously, whether there be child labor issues or other issues just around general kind of societal impact of that industry, as well as the environmental negatives, the cobalt mining is particularly seen to be negative, and certainly there's a reasonable argument for that. Again, I think it is important to note when we talk about environment that if you are to examine electric vehicles under that microscope, it's probably only reasonable you should do that to everything else you consume. And, you know, whether you fly your avocados from Chile, which also has a huge amount of water impact, or you compare how your oil and gas that you fuel your house or your car with, you need to probably look at both of those things as well if you're going to do that to electric vehicles. And perhaps it's not the most fair and reasoned argument at the moment. As a small point, but I think a really important point, the benefit of, as we see the switch happening with electric vehicles, there are so much more manufacturers now involved in this. Of course, the investment then goes into it, and of course, things like cost, things like environmental impact are all being reduced. And Tesla now make most of their standard range vehicles with lithium iron phosphate batteries or technology, and that means they don't actually have any cobalt or any nickel in them. And as it says there, where Tesla lead, particularly in battery technology, but to be honest, in electric cars as a whole, others do tend to follow. And there's a lot of elements of that coming down the line. I think the independent article is quite recent around solid state batteries and what that could do to have both the range actually of electric vehicles, but also the impact on the environment, and obviously the long-term usability and so on and so on. So I suppose a qualified yes would be my suggestion, Justine, in terms of better for the environment. Certainly, it's not a simple calculation, and it's not just me saying that, but I think it would be difficult to argue that it's better to stay with gas-guzzling SUVs I think it would be difficult to argue that it's not better to walk everywhere and cycle everywhere. So that's probably on each individual person's choice as to which route they wish to take.
Thank you for that. It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? I've you know, been mulling this over with my husband as well, so I'm particularly interested in it actually. But yeah, there's a lot of things to think about, and I don't think you can really have a conversation about anything, any aspect of life anymore, really, without thinking about the environmental impact and the human rights and everything else that goes with it. We're changing as a planet, aren't we?
And I think it's
So
great, isn't it? I mean, if you look beyond the particulars of that,
yeah,
it's what a great thing to celebrate. It certainly brings up more debate and more challenge. So I think, yeah, it's a great thing, as you say.
yeah, absolutely. And there was so many things that used to be kind of going on under the radar that are now out
Yeah,
in the open. So I
absolutely.
think that it's better to have a more honest debate, isn't it?
Mm.
So on that basis, I've got another question for you then. Are electric vehicles not more expensive versus typical combustion engine vehicles?
Yeah, and at this point, I guess I've got actually a slide here that might be useful to kind of explain. So yes, in a P11D sense, to use accounting terminology, yes, definitely. And in a list price sense, typically electric vehicles have been. I think it's worth sort of hot off the pressing this a little bit in terms of a lot of the stuff that's happening in this 2023, this year. There's an awful lot of cars coming to market that are, if you know the Aura Funky Cat, Justine, for example, look that one up in your EV research. It's a Chinese brand. It wouldn't necessarily win a lot of design awards, but it's a very cheap electric vehicle from a Chinese brand, Aura. So yeah, that's now come to the UK, and there are lots of other ones coming down the line, if you like. So certainly that has been the case. It probably continues to be the case if you really draw comparisons like for like vehicles. But of course, the question naturally then, from a salary sacrifice point of view, then comes to, well, yes, but this is, I suppose, where salary sacrifice becomes so valuable. So I suppose we've got a worked example. I thought this would be good to bring to our accounting professionals, and this is put together by our own chartered accountant. So there we go, who works in house with our product team. So this is Jack. This is not actually Jack, just to be clear. Jack is not suffering from a GDPR breach. Jack is an imaginary person, but he's a 29-year-old professional living in Aberdeen, working in an accountancy firm, and his salary is £35,000 a year. So Jack's net sacrifice, yeah, and sorry, it does about 8,000 miles. And Jack currently has been driving a Volkswagen Golf, and he's looking at the ID3, which is the kind of nice, about as simple a comparison as one can give. They're not really like for like exactly, but certainly the Golf has now been discontinued, one of these kind of very well-known cars, and it's being replaced it's being replaced by the ID3, the Volkswagen ID3. So a nice like for like, if you can call it that comparison. So if we go to the next slide, sorry. So it is really important with salary sacrifice, and I think one of the things, going into a lot of detail on this perhaps is not necessary today, but it's really important that one doesn't just look at a monthly payment, and that is probably the biggest challenge of salary sacrifice, getting one's head around the gross payslip deduction amounts when you have everything bundled in and zero deposit. In terms of comparisons with other people's monthly payments or your current monthly payment or whatever else. So there are some things that need to be factored in, certainly. One of the things always to ask is, what's the deposit paid in the previous car? Certainly, how much is insurance costing? And how much does servicing maintenance cost? So a monthly payment from 2019, say, of £280 might actually be in reality more like £402 if you actually factor in the things on a like-for-like basis. Because you've got those things that aren't maybe included, particularly deposit. So why does it work? Well, again, simplistically, in this example, the salary sacrifice, if you can see there, is actually £684. So it's significantly more than Jack is currently paying for his £280 a month Golf, before we get into fuel or anything else, which would be an additional saving. But when you then factor in, actually, Jack has got £402 once you think about the different charges that he has included, and then you've got £233 of your total motoring costs paid for by your net tax savings, because obviously you've got an element of benefit in kind you have to pay to have this benefit through your employment. One of the big questions we have been asked over the last 12 months is benefit in kind. I'm sure from this audience, Justine, I won't need to say so, but there was a bit of a cliff edge looming of 2025 with the benefit in kind rates, and obviously on 3-year agreements, that's really important. But November just 2022, and the budget announced that it obviously would be going through to 2028 with very low, albeit slightly higher, but very low tax rates on electric vehicles, which is brilliant for the adoption of the scheme, and brilliant for uptake, and just generally, I think, brilliant for the electric vehicle kind of future and the road to net zero kind of conversation. So that's something that actually we didn't think would stay as low as it was when we were doing our predictions. So it was great news when that was announced. And it does mean that for organizations and individuals, you've got a bit more certainty, because obviously there was a period there where we were talking to people about a 3-year agreement where the last 6 months of the agreement, we're not sure what it will be taxed at. And that's obviously a little bit more difficult. The tax saving was so significant, it would be difficult to overall for it to have been a negative. But we now have that confidence in the benefit in kind rates, which is great. And of course, there is an element of this is a £35,000 a year salary. Of course, as you go further up the salary brackets, there's more and more savings, particularly as you get into the high rate taxpayers. Salary sacrifice on EVs becomes even more attractive. But it is interesting that the perception may be that electric vehicles is more expensive when you then factor in the savings they're making, perhaps from a tax point of view, perhaps isn't as simple as more expensive as a summary. And as I say, fuel, and if the company has the ability to claim back a percentage of the VAT and then passes that back to the employee and chooses to do so, obviously those are just layered on top of this. So yeah, that kind of answers, I suppose, that with salary sacrifice. And as I say, as a general sense, there are more and more electric vehicles out there. So don't necessarily think that if you don't have a salary sacrifice scheme, you won't be able to access cars that are kind of affordable from an EV point of view. That is increasingly going to be the case. Hopefully that helps. And a very whistle-stop tour of a breakdown of salary sacrifice.
I think that was a good breakdown as well. And actually, when I worked in practice, I used to implement a lot of salary sacrifice schemes for lots of benefits, but cars in the main. And I completely agree with you that the most necessary thing is to sit down and have quite a comprehensive conversation with the employee about what it actually entails, because it can actually either build trust or break down trust between the employer and the employee. So it's really, really important to make sure that you get that slide that you've just put up there and sit down with the employee and go through it all, because then the employee is much more likely to trust that and want to go with it and understand it. Because the term salary sacrifice, as you pointed out earlier, salary exchange is probably a much better term. So term salary sacrifice always sounds as if you're giving something up and it's going to hurt you in the process, and you're not going to get anything in return, which is completely wrong, of course. But yeah, so another question for you then, Piers. What are lead times like on electric vehicles these days?
So yes, again, something that's been really challenging over the last 2 years, semiconductor issues, war in Ukraine, all sorts of different elements. Who knew that so many wiring looms, for example, were built in Ukraine for a lot of the cars that we drive. But yeah, lead times as a general automotive industry been difficult, and for electric vehicles as demand has soared and supply hasn't really kind of kept up with it. That's been really challenging. I think as we've seen January, February, March 2023, that's kind of been the end of that long-term problem. And we've now got this amazing thing called stock, which is something that we've not had for 3 years pretty much. But also there's an element of electric vehicles now themselves are just starting to be a lot more available on a factory order point of view as well. So if you've got really specific ideas of what you want, it's a little bit easier. Average delivery timescale last quarter was actually 68 days, about 2 months. It's probably worth looking at about 3 months out. And there are a large amount of pre-orders in the marketplace now, meaning you really should be able to get any car within 8 to 12 weeks pretty much. There are a few exceptions. Porsche Taycan, if you're really excited about the high-end ones, that will take longer. And there are some others like that too. Audi Q4 e-tron can still be a bit of a challenge. But generally speaking, Tesla actually being the best turnaround. That blue car is an MG4, which is about a £25,000 model, which has been very, very popular in salary sacrifice as well, because it's got a great kind of reputation. It's good quality car and actually very affordable as well. we probably won't see supply turn back to pre-pandemic levels, interestingly, until about 2024. It's about 5 years, half a decade before it normalizes again fully. But one thing I would say was electric vehicles in particular, as many of the listeners may well be aware, the options on electric vehicles are much more limited and often are actually already built into the car themselves, and you just choose to turn them on or turn them off, essentially. So it makes the manufacturing and the availability of those vehicles a lot easier because, for example, Tesla, there is one type of Model 3 and that's it. That's all you're getting pretty much in terms of specification inside. You can then have a different color interior. You might have different wheels and that's about it. And of course, you've got different ranges. So I suppose slightly more combinations in a way, but certainly not all the kind of customizable options you would have had in previous models and previous technologies. So yeah, lead times I think are probably a problem of the past now, Justine. There are other problems that will come up, and infrastructure I think is the big challenge for those who don't have off-street parking, as I mentioned earlier, but lead times are certainly better. And as you said, just as a small point on the salary sacrifice conversation, yeah, hugely important that each individual person has their own kind of review of it, because I think personally, and this is just a comment to some degree personally, as a business involved in this, there should be more regulation around the way that's provided and the way it's discussed with employees, because there are too many people entering this space at the moment that are just putting up an online portal and hoping the employees can figure that out. And you know, it is quite a complicated thing for anybody because of the different things that are pulled into it, from insurance to maintenance to cut tires and all these different elements and VAT and so on and so on. And it certainly needs to be explained really well, as you say, because as you say, any benefit that becomes a negative is really no longer a benefit, and can be counterproductive what you were trying to achieve. So really important, I think, that is something that gets really carefully looked at when you're suggesting what you're going to do with this. I do have a couple of resources as well, Justine, in terms of independent resources that we have. Some Living with Electric, we call it. There's all sorts of blogs and content that we were just about to launch a bit more of that as well in the coming weeks and months. But ZapMap is a great place for infrastructure. They've actually just been bought by an American company called Allstar, sorry. And the technology is kind of moving forward even quicker now, but it's a really good interactive app you can use to find charge points, but also to find when they're available, how many are being used right now, and so on and so on. And then the Energy Saving Trust continues to be a great resource, perhaps an underused resource by a lot of people around this kind of subject matter, not just electric vehicles actually, but a really great resource to try and access, and obviously as a good independent, non-biased resource as well. So some extra things you can use if you're looking to kind of consider general subject matter around this. And I just thought, Justine, I think you mentioned a little bit about fuel and hydrogen. So I thought I'll give you the option for any other questions you may have in terms of that and anything else that's popped up during the webinar. This is normally the crowd get to ask, but it's all onto you today, Justine.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important, you know, to consider. I like the idea of the ZapMap. I think that's really good. Because obviously if you are traveling around in your car, then you need to know where the electric points are that are free, because the last thing you want is to be sitting in a queue for a couple of hours. There's only so many Costa coffees you can drink, isn't there, really?
That's right.
So and other brands are available, obviously.
I should say that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in hydrogen batteries, because yeah, I heard about them, I don't know, maybe a decade ago or something like that, and I found the idea fascinating that we could potentially make use of a basically unlimited resource in terms of hydrogen, which is all around us and everywhere we go, and the air that we breathe. So actually, the idea of being able to fuel cars using hydrogen batteries is something that I feel fascinated about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we connected on this before briefly, Justine, and again, I would not profess to be an expert and really point that out, other than, you know, being involved in this on a daily basis. I certainly am not a scientist that can give you a really detailed analysis of this. We fortunately have a client, NanoSun, who's doing great work in this space. and they've tried to explain to me quite a number of times around hydrogen, and I think I've got the kind of maybe not even quite GCSE level of understanding of what they're trying to explain to me. So I'll give you that version if I may. But from what I understand, and from where it looks like the future is, again, all of these things are investment led, aren't they? So if they're being invested in, then the investment spurs investment, which spurs investment. And if they're not, then the opposite obviously happens. It seems like the money is following hydrogen as a storage resource, if you like. So, for example, one of the big challenges we have in the UK is that renewable power, we're up in Scotland today, and we produce enough renewable power to do far more with it than we can, because we can't store it and we can't transport it, and the grid itself can't really handle it. A lot of the renewable sources are actually being turned off, or not actually producing the electricity that we could be using. And so there is an argument, or there's a possibility, I should say, and a definite possibility, where hydrogen could be used in that capacity, apparently more, and certainly as well in terms of bigger freight possibilities with hydrogen, is what I understand from the experts who are involved in this on a more daily basis than I am. In terms of a kind of hydrogen fueling vehicles kind of point of view, Toyota obviously pursued that for a while. They've come out of that now, and a lot of them, the sort of hydrogen fueling stations and that kind of side of hydrogen seem to be getting shut down now. Shell have pulled out most of the London ones, most of the German ones. So yeah, it looks like we're gonna end up with electric vehicles in the way it currently looks, but what that might look like from the battery technology within those vehicles, yeah, there's so much development going on, and there is, obviously Elon Musk has said repeatedly that we're nowhere near the end point of what the technology looks like, and that there are, I think he put it recently in one of the press conferences, that we don't even know our main competitor yet, because there's someone going to come out of somewhere that's just going to be out of left field. So, and obviously clearly China are leading on a lot of different elements of electric vehicles, battery production, battery technology, and everything else. So we perhaps don't even see what's coming down the line in that space yet. So yeah, certainly lots to come out. And I think, that maybe is something similar around the technology. We haven't actually seen what the next stage is. I think when you look at vehicles particularly, the kind of capital intensive manufacturing process means that, once you pick a horse as a manufacturer, you pretty much need to stick to it. And we've seen that with Jaguar Land Rover. Unfortunately, the other way around is they probably picked the wrong horse, and now they've got a pretty expensive unwinding process. With VW Group, biggest manufacturer in the world, and obviously Tesla, there's a reason why these guys are dominating at the moment. It's because they've really backed EVs, and I think that will just probably gather momentum over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I think it's quite insightful of Elon Musk, as I'm sure we can all imagine. There's a reason why he's the billionaire that he is.
Yeah.
Just for him to say that, his biggest competitor, it hasn't arrived yet, and will pop up at some point out of left field. So it's interesting, isn't it? We're just at the beginning of the journey, really, aren't we? But yeah, so. That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Piers.
Well, thank you.
So do you want to do this last slide, Piers?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I guess the principle in terms of the shift to electric vehicles, we've got a great team, and we do call it partnerships, because I think it's something we partner in that road to net zero. And we're always happy to be a kind of a conduit for thoughts, advice, questions. I think we are really aware that there's a lot of perhaps education is the wrong way to put it, but awareness that needs to be raised in this space, and a lot of questions, a lot of fears, a lot of doubts, and so on and so on. So we'd love to hear from anybody who's got any questions. Love feedback as well, and challenges to some of the content is always great too, because I think from an infrastructure point of view in particular, we do get challenges quite regularly, and it's great to be informed. And there's so much happening in this space, we can't possibly be aware of everything every day. So we always like to hear from prospective clients, or from clients, or indeed from partners. So do feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and if you'd like to look at making the shift to electric vehicles, or particularly salary sacrifice, we'd love to hear from you.
Oh, that's great, Piers. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just going to move on and say, well, thank you very much, Piers, for taking the time to present this invaluable information to our members and beyond. Because we do get a lot of people accessing these webinars after the fact, so it's great. So please remember, members of ICAS, that you can keep up to date with all the latest tax and other professional news, including the latest information, guides and resources on icas.com. You can access technical support through the ICAS Technical Help Desk, available through the Contact Us section of our website, which covers audit and accounting, tax, practice support, anti-money laundering and ethics. So it only leaves me once again to thank Piers very much for presenting today, and of course to you, our audience, for watching this ICAS webinar. Until next time, goodbye.